Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Kinane. Coming up, cattlemen finally get compensation, but not from the MLA. New York approves gay marriage. Could Australia follow? And what chance the tobacco industry could win its legal case against the federal government? Our panel tonight, former Liberal advisor and social media consultant Tommy Tudhope, author and blogger Anthony Lowenstein, and in Canberra, ABC social media reporter Latika Burke. Well, it seems that Australians are losing interest in taking action on carbon pollution. The Lowy Institute's annual survey asked around 1,000 people for their opinions on a range of topics, including climate change. The poll found just 41% believe urgent action is needed, down 5 points from last year, down 27 points from 5 years ago.
We've seen the failure of the Copenhagen climate change talks. We've seen significant questioning of the science behind climate change. And I think we've seen the domestic political divide in terms of action on climate change become much sharper and much more divisive. And so I think all of that has led to a steady slide in public support for taking action on this issue.
The poll was taken in March this year. Now, Latika, this is a huge shift in opinion. 41% of Australians now think addressing climate change is a serious and pressing issue. 27 points down from 5 years ago. It's a huge shift.
Yeah, and it correlates with every other poll that's come out in probably the last 12 to 18 months that really does show that the government's actions or fight to address climate change are going to be made that bit harder, because between 2007, when you could say that support for climate change and, importantly, paying for climate change at the personal level was at its peak. Now, of course, we know what happened to Kevin Rudd. He squandered that opportunity. He failed to go to a double dissolution election, which might have seen his emissions trading scheme through. So now that Labor is trying round two on an emissions trading scheme, its fight is all that much harder, and much of it because of its own doing.
Tommy, what do you point that 27-point swing down to in the 5-year period?
Yeah, I think Latika made a fair point there. I think, 2006, 2007, we had Kyoto, we had Inconvenient Truth, we had Al Gore trumping his myths as well. But since then, Kevin Rudd's really squandered the first opportunity with his ETS or CPRS, but Labor's message is really the core problem here. They're still barking on about, saving the environment, save the planet. They need to prosecute an economic message for having a carbon tax, and it's that lack of clear narrative that's really undermined that message, and I'm not surprised at all that this had a significant drop. I think also you probably have to factor in there the very effective campaign that Tony Abbott has undertaken in the last 12 months. I think that would partly attribute to these low sort of figures.
And your thoughts on this?
I think one of the things that comes out is that the Labor Party has been so incompetent at selling the message. I mean, yes, I think I agree with Tommy that that Abbott's Liberal Party has run a campaign which essentially says climate change might be real, yes, but the way we're going to prosecute is going to be very, very different. The problem, I think, also is that many people who advocate and support doing something on climate change, as I do, have actually not been tolerant enough about dissent, about that discussion. So a debate requires a debate. It doesn't require simply saying to someone, my view is right and yours is wrong. I'm not saying there are two equal sides. I think climate change is real and the science shows that unequivocally. But ultimately there needs to be a debate by people actually who can prosecute an argument. Gillard cannot sell anything, including her own house. I mean, clearly she's in a position where anything she says... A few days ago on AM, she was talking about the year since Rudd was assassinated. All she said was, I'm prosecuting a reform agenda 15 times. That's not it says nothing to anyone about anything. So
could this all change once they get the details out?
They hope so. I mean, maybe. I mean, certainly at least they can argue how much people are going to have to pay for electricity and everything. And most people are struggling out there to pay for their lives. That's what people care about ultimately. And the people who worry about, like me, living in the city, actually see it very differently. I think there's been a lot less dissent and toleration of different views about this than there should be from my side, so to speak.
So you think calling people deniers and sceptics has hampered the pro-carbon tax?
I think there are a lot of people who have prosecuted the argument to support climate change who have not been open enough to debate. I mean, whether you use the word denier, sceptic, I think comparing people to Holocaust deniers, as some people have, is just absurd and also offensive, frankly.
Steve, I would also add there that I think a lot of this is to do with carbon tax fatigue or carbon price fatigue, climate change fatigue, whatever you want to call it, because we've been discussing this issue for now about 4 to 5 years, and quite intensely this issue has dominated politics, whether it be the policy aspect or the political aspect in claiming leaders like Malcolm Turnbull and Kevin Rudd. This has been really at the forefront of the debate, and it would come as no surprise to people that, you know, maybe 3 years ago, tabloid and commercial news outlets were saying, no more climate change stories. We don't think the audience is listening. And I wonder now if they're still listening.
Well, another part of that Lowy Institute report was that 3/4 of Australians felt the federal government had done a poor job of addressing the climate change issue. Both major parties have continued selling their competing tax cuts and carbon compensation plans. The Prime Minister is promising what she calls a battler's buffer to ensure the poorest Australians are more than compensated for any cost of living rises.
We will be working with Australians, 9 out of 10 households getting a tax cut or a payment increase, millions not paying a cent, and for the lower income households, we'll make sure that there's a safety net there, a buffer, so that they're actually getting 20% more than the expected impact on them of a price on carbon, because we realise they're the Australians with the absolutely tightest budgets and the least room for manoeuvre.
The Treasurer has questioned how the opposition will pay for its promised tax cuts, offering to let Treasury help them out with the costings.
We will make the Treasury available to Mr Hockey and to Mr Abbott to cost their policies so all Australians can understand how accurate Mr Abbott's statements are.
But Tony Abbott has rejected Wayne Swan's offer, sticking to his promise of tax cuts without a carbon tax.
The government keeps peddling this lie that the rest of the world is on the verge of introducing carbon taxes and emissions trading scheme, that we've got to do this urgently.
We'll miss the boat.
We've got to do this urgently or we're going to be left behind. Well, absolute nonsense on stilts. That's what it is. It is absolute nonsense on stilts. It's deliberate deception from a government which couldn't lie straight in bed, to be honest.
Tommy, opposition's always complained they don't have the same resources as governments. Why isn't the coalition taking this offer up from Wayne Swan or Julie Gillard?
I think politically, Tony Abbott doesn't want spend any minute or any hour of any day talking about the coalition's policy when the government is so hampered and so hamstrung talking about their own policy. I think it's an easy political fix for him to say, thanks but no thanks. I'd rather talk about the carbon tax, and I think that's probably the political motivation behind it. But as I understand, I think this is probably a longer piece of policy announcement for Tony Abbott, a series of tax announcements at least. And I think, policies are normally costed in an election time frame, not in between. I don't recall any Labor Party policy being costed in between elections.
Anthony, fair enough, 2 years out, that they wait till the election until they start giving the details?
Probably, yes. In terms of the electoral cycle, I agree with Tommy. I think it's probably unlikely that the Libs would even care doing it. But to me, there's a bigger question here. When Labor continually talks about selling a carbon tax and how it's going to help, how they're going to help the lower-income people, there still, I think, is a case out there that people, as the Lowy Institute poll says, need to know and be told and explained why action needs to be taken. I still think Latika's right. We've had years of this discussion, but a lot of people out there do not actually believe that we need to take action. I mean, we're still at the stage where simply saying to someone, your power bills are going to go up because Gillard says that climate change is real, it's not a good enough reason anymore. We need to get past that. And I think, Abbott's playing politics as any opposition leader would, fair enough. But I think the bigger question really is that this comes down to the question of economic management. And I think one of the options always is that we keep on being told the Libs are better at this. The truth is that the Libs have been in power now, Labor. Disparity between rich and poor has only got higher. We live, I think, under this myth in many of the Western democracies that neoliberal policies make things more equal. In fact, the opposite is true. And I think many people who talk about imposing a carbon tax don't realise that unless they do it by explaining why different economic policies are necessary, things will not get through.
Maybe we need a large-scale taxpayer-funded advertising campaign. That'll solve
I disagree.
Latika, Wayne Swan and Joe Hockey were trading letters today over this issue of tax cuts and Treasury.
Yes, Wayne Swan penned a rather fervent letter to Joe Hockey today and then included in the last line, and in the interests of public debate, I'm going to release this letter to the media. Now, I think initial responses to Joe Hockey's aren't worth or aren't fit for broadcast, but he did give some on-the-record comments later and basically told Wayne Swan to stop worrying about the coalition's policies. Now, of course, it's the government and the opposition's job to worry about each other's policies policies. Now, incidentally, we have two sides of politics, both proposing huge policies, huge spending and tax cuts and also revenue taking without much detail there. Now, the difference is the government says it can deliver its details in a couple of weeks, albeit after a few months' delay there. When the opposition will release their costings, well, we don't know. And remember, earlier this year we had this situation where the Liberals went through some phantom budget cuts and they nearly tore themselves apart over whose departments would be suffering cuts and whose wasn't. And keeping in mind that none of these cuts were really going to be realised, certainly not in the next couple of years while Labor was still in government. So that could be an interesting exercise in itself, Steve.
Tommy, can the nation afford tax cuts? I mean, we had Heather Ridout from the industry group on the weekend saying, you know, once you give a tax cut, you have to pay for them forever. And at the moment, the budget is not only a deficit, it's in structural deficit.
Well, there is an argument that tax cuts actually increase productivity. Depends what the tax cuts are. And I think that's obviously the key detail that Abbott's missing. But I think before tax cuts, I think there's probably more spending that can be found in the budget. And I think if the Liberals really want to get some economic mileage, they should be advocating more cuts to spending rather than tax cuts per se. And I think, you know, that's probably an area that Joe should be focusing on.
Well, the vote for the Federal Liberal Party presidency was a fascinating contest over the weekend. Tony Abbott had encouraged former Howard Government Minister Peter Reith to stand, but then voted for his rival, the incumbent Alan Stockdale. In the end, the former Victorian Treasurer scraped through by just one vote.
I have been honoured to be involved with this party for virtually my whole life. It means a great, great deal to me, and I feel very humbled to have the vote of confidence that this ballot represents. I want to thank Peter for the way he and I have conducted the campaign between us. It has been, as between him and me, quite civilised and cordial even.
Latika, the way it's being reported is that Tony Abbott encouraged Peter Reith to run and then voted for Alan Stockdale, and we know that he voted for Alan Stockdale because he did the show and tell, and the cameras caught that. Is that correct?
Yeah, there seems to be a few differing accounts. I've got to say,